Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating analysis that completely reframes our understanding of human history. In this analysis, we revealed a scientific reality of ancient Iran. It shifts the origins of civilization away from a story of myth and instead shows us a history of rigorous administrative engineering based on the first and second laws of thermodynamics. We're going to explore how early societies established data as their fundamental law, detail the massive achievements of the Achaemenid Empire, and expose how climate-driven collapse allowed doomsayers to erase this scientific legacy. Ultimately, it shows us why we aren't actually inventing our future today, we are remembering our true origins.
It's an incredible hook, isn't it? What if the foundations of civilization weren't built on myth at all, but on the literal laws of thermodynamics? According to the source material we're analyzing today, early humans didn't just look up at the sky and imagine gods. By ascending to the high altitudes of the Zagros and Alborz mountains on the Iranian plateau, they found the perfect crystal-clear vantage point. Up there, they mapped the heavens, mastered time and space, and established what this research calls the world's very first unified scientific theory.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, the thermodynamics of antiquity and mapping the heavens from the Iranian plateau.
Now, the core argument here starts with pure observation. The ancients closely observed energy, heat, and change in the natural world, which led them directly to the concept of Ohrmazd. In a lot of traditional historical texts, you're going to see Ohrmazd described as a deity to be worshipped. But this research posits something entirely different. It argues impartially that Ohrmazd was actually a scientific representation. It represented the synthesis of reason and positive energy, effectively what we now call the first law of thermodynamics.
This understanding formed what the source calls the dialectic of antiquity. Think of it like universal scale. On one side, you have the first law, Ohrmazd, representing positive energy and reason. On the other side, you have the second law, Ahriman, representing entropy and decay. And crucially, this system included the Amishespenta. The source notes these functioned not as angels, but as the underlying physical mechanics and logical attributes of that positive energy. Together, this dialectic formed a unified theory encompassing the four elements, the three life forms, and celestial energy. So the ultimate goal of early society wasn't religious devotion. It was the logical management of universal energy to prevent societal decay.
Let's move along and see how this builds in Section 2, the first administrative state and the invention of data. So how do you physically apply the laws of thermodynamics to human society? Well, the sheer scale of this administrative achievement expands thousands of years across the Iranian plateau. Around 4000 BCE, the Sumerians and Elamites lay the groundwork with base 60 math and cuneiform. Fast forward to 500 BCE, and the Achaemenids are modernizing Parsinsia into the Grand Persepolis. And amazingly, even as late as 600 CE, the Sasanians are still applying this science by providing academic sanctuaries for scholars. It's an unbroken thread of scientific governance.
To really grasp how this started, the text gives us a fascinating linguistic breakdown. In Persian, the word el signifies the tribe. Alam, the plural, represents a community of tribes. The analysis argues that the Sumerians and Proto-Elamites were the true architects of civilization's democratic architecture simply because they organized these tribal communities using pure logic and law.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that to manage these communities, they didn't just guess. They engineered specific, practical tools. They created a base 60 mathematical system specifically to synchronize their daily lives with the movements of the heavens. They invented the cuneiform alphabet, the real nuts and bolts of order, to track assets and define physical boundaries. And most importantly, the Sumerians and Elamites established data as the first law of society to formally record individual legal rights. When we hear data today, we instantly think of computers, right? But for them, data was essentially the world's first democratic architecture deliberately designed to resist the entropic decay of social order.
Let's scale things up in Section 3, engineering the Achaemenid Empire and standardizing the science of governance.
This localized architecture was eventually scaled up globally through what's known as the Achaemenid synthesis. It's literally a masterclass in massive administrative scaling. Led by brilliant minds, Atassa first provides the strategic vision to orchestrate the revision and standardization of the cuneiform script. Then, Darius the Great establishes the famous royal roads, turning them into the physical administrative arteries of the empire. Finally, they completely modernize the ancient town of Pars into the grand mathematical structure of Persepolis. It was all about turning science into a standardized global tool.
And they left the receipts of this science carved right into the stone. Consider the iconic relief of the lion and the bull at Persepolis.
The source highlights that this wasn't just mere decoration meant to look imposing. It was a deliberate, measurable constant. By honoring the age of Taurus that had occurred 1,000 years prior, their placement of the lion and the bull anchored the architecture to an astronomical constant. It was a brilliant way to ensure historical continuity for future generations.
And this brilliantly illustrates a core correction the source makes regarding our modern understanding of history, specifically the famous Behistun inscription. If you look at the standard Western or Abrahamic interpretation, you see a story of a ruler acting by unilateral divine decree, with Baga translated as God and Ohrmazd as a deity. But the administrative reality presented in our source is entirely different. It corrects the record, proving the inscription is actually about a constitutional crisis resolved via the Majestan, the world's first reasoned administrative forum. In this context, Baga represents the synthesis of reason, and Ohrmazd, as we discussed earlier, is that first law of thermodynamics. It was a crisis solved by logic and conversation, not top-down religion.
Because their foundation was so strictly scientific, their astronomy was absolutely unmatched. The source actually calls Iranian astronomy the engine of history. The analysis claims that highly accurate astronomical observation drove pivotal historical events. It details how it was the Magi of Iran who predicted the birth of Christ using planetary alignments. Later on, Salman Parsi used the exact timing of a solar eclipse to empower the movement that would become Islam. However, the source argues impartially that this objective science was subsequently hijacked by religious leaders who twisted these celestial events to solidify their own power.
Which brings us to a darker chapter in Section 4. The Great Historical Erasure and the Weaponization of Dogma.
You might be wondering, how do you hide thousands of years of scientific governance? Well, the analysis outlines a tragic sequence, the mechanics of erasure, and it started with the environment. Climate-driven collapse destroyed crops, which naturally weakened the empires on the plateau. This sudden social instability opened the door for what the source calls doomsayers to seize power. They systematically replaced the fluid, thermodynamic reality with strict, static dogma. And to finalize their takeover, they literally physically destroyed the evidence, burning massive libraries like Gandhi Shapur and destroying the Sasanian astronomical tables.
The text uses a really striking phrase to describe this event. Quote, "They lobotomized human memory," claiming that civilization began with their holy books to hide the fact that humans had already governed themselves with free will for millennia. According to the research, this wasn't just some accident of history. It was a highly calculated move to sever humanity from the fact that it once thrived on free will and logical self-governance.
But it's not all lost. Let's look at Section 5, the return of reason, and the Parthian and Sasanian legacy.
So the crucial point here is that this science wasn't completely erased. It was preserved in tangible ways. You can see a very clear progression of empires mastering time and order. The Elamites used cuneiform data to track assets. The Achaemenids used the Persepolis line and bull to provide a permanent astronomical constant. And the Sasanians built on all of this with the crown of Yazdegerd III, a tool specifically designed to visually measure time and calculate life.
The Parthians and Sasanians essentially acted as a massive sanctuary, preserving the science for the future. They inherited the ancient scientific language and evolved it, developing Pahlavi specifically as a tool for precise logic. They continued practicing that recursive thermodynamic dialectic of Ohrmazd and the Ahriman, and remarkably, the source highlights that while Europe was literally burning its astronomers for heresy during the Roman Inquisition, the Iranian Empire was providing sanctuary for those fleeing scientists. They actively integrated Greek science and Eastern logic into massive academic centers.
The core thesis of the author really hits home here. You simply cannot permanently suppress natural law. The phonetic precision of cuneiform and the administrative science of the Sumerians are universal truths. As the source powerfully states, we are not inventing our future, we are remembering our true origins.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. If the source code of the universe cannot be deleted, if the thermodynamic foundations of our very first societies are still visible in the stone and script of ancient Iran, what other lost scientific truths are out there, just waiting to be remembered? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. I hope it sparked your curiosity as much as it did mine.